I still remember the taste of rust in the air. Not fear rust, the kind that clings to your tongue when the room hasn't been opened in years. The walls dripped from the heat, and somewhere in the dark, metal scraped against metal. My hand was steady, but my pulse wasn't. I could hear the seconds slow, deliberate, like someone was winding a clock just to watch me sweat. We weren't supposed to be there. Hell, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that part of the city. But once you've seen the shape of a thing they say doesn't exist, you can't look away. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. Berlin, August 1974. It started with the wrong kind of silence. I was sitting in a cramped apartment in Berlin's Schneeberg district, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor sneeze, but thick enough to block the faintest signal. The shortwave radio on my desk had been hissing for hours until it didn't. Then came the broadcast, clipped, flat, and not meant for public ears. A capsule NASA, unmanned, had gone down in the Atlantic. Coordinates given. Recovery in progress. Then, nothing. I lit a cigarette and leaned back. The official schedule didn't list the launch. No one had briefed me about any mission. That meant one of two things. Either someone had messed up spectacularly, or we were about to witness something that would never be entered into the record. I wrote the coordinates in my notebook, tearing the page out immediately. Pages have a way of getting you killed. By the next morning, the chatter had vanished. No references in the usual intercepts, no panic among the suits at the consulate, not even a whisper from Langley. It was as if the transmission had been a hallucination. I knew better. Berlin had a way of coughing up these ghosts, flashes of reality that didn't survive the next round of reports. I made my first call to a contact in Bremerhaven, an old port inspector who owed me more than a few favors. He claimed he'd seen a naval tug pull into harbor late in the night. No lights, no markings, crew bundled up like they were moving a corpse in winter. He didn't get close. He didn't want to. Said the deck was empty when it left port at dawn. That was the first red flag. The second was that he called me from a payphone. 2 days later, a package arrived at the drop site near Savigny-Plitz. Inside, a damp, salt-stained scrap of metal, roughly the size of my palm. One side was smooth and painted white. The other was scorched and pitted. Etched into the clean surface was part of a serial number NASA property, no doubt about it. I wrapped it in oilcloth and stashed it in my wall safe, wondering how many people had touched it before me. I took the piece to a man we called the locksmith, though he'd never cut a key in his life. He had an eye for metallurgy and an ear for gossip. He confirmed it wasn't from any documented capsule he knew of. Too light, too heat-resistant, too deliberate. He didn't like holding it. That made two of us. The odd part was how quickly the heat cooled around me. Normally, sniffing around a matter like this would have half a dozen agencies breathing down my neck. Instead, I got nothing. No tales on the street, no sudden break-ins, no dead drops gone missing. The absence of interference was the biggest tell. Someone wanted me to keep digging at least for now. By the week's end, a courier from Langley dropped by under the guise of a friendly check-in. He was fresh-faced, too polite, and asked just enough about my recent interests to make it clear he knew exactly what I was doing. His advice: stay in your lane. The way he said it sounded less like a warning and more like a dare. Night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the capsule hadn't just vanished, it had been erased. And that kind of erasure doesn't happen unless the people holding the pen are sitting on both sides of the table. And that's when I decided to find out who had the pen. The hangar smelled like cold oil and dust. You don't forget that smell. It sticks to your clothes, your hair, your skin. I was there on borrowed credentials, a name stitched into a badge. That would stop working the second someone asked the wrong question. It was winter in Moscow, the kind that froze the air before you could breathe it in. My cover was civilian contractor, here to assess aerospace salvage for potential resale to Eastern Bloc allies. No one in that room believed it, but no, one cared enough to challenge it yet, and then I saw it. The capsule sat under a string of flickering lights, a dull shadow of what it must have been before re-entry had burned it to hell. The hull was mottled with black scars, but the NASA insignia was still visible, flanked by the words United States in block letters. It looked absurd there, surrounded by red stars and Cyrillic stencils. The Soviets hadn't hidden it. They'd put it right in the center, like a trophy on a shelf. Guards lingered in the corners, their hands resting loosely on their rifles, the kind of posture that says they're confident no one's getting close. An engineer in a grease-stained coat circled it slowly, tapping a clipboard with a pencil. His eyes never left the seams along the hatch. I pretended to be unimpressed, taking notes in a small ledger, while my real attention roamed the periphery exit routes, guard rotations, the location of the nearest blind spots in the camera coverage. My guide, a bored lieutenant, explained in flat Russian that the Americans had lost their toy and that the motherland had found it. He smiled when he said it, like a man repeating someone else's punchline. What he didn't say was why the KGB would risk bringing it here, into a space where outsiders could see it. A find like this should have been buried in a bunker, stripped in secret, never spoken of again. That was standard. This was theater. I asked a deliberately naive question about whether the capsule still functioned. The lieutenant laughed, said it was dead as a stone, and patted the hull like it was a dog that had served its purpose. But as he moved on, I caught sight of something he hadn't noticed, or pretended not to notice. Along the base of the module, near one of the heat shield panels, there was a fresh weld. The metal was clean, too clean for something that had just survived atmospheric re-entry. When the tour ended, I lingered near the entryway, scribbling meaningless numbers into my ledger. Through the half-open hangar door, I heard the metallic echo of something heavy being unbolted. Not dismantled, accessed. That's a different sound. I left the hangar with more questions than I'd arrived with. Outside, the cold bit through my coat, but my mind was somewhere else, stuck on the image of that weld and the quiet, methodical way the engineers had been circling their prize. That should have been the end of it. But 2 nights later, a message arrived in the dead drop under the tram bridge. 6 words, no signature. It wasn't for them either. The rumor started as a whisper from Leningrad. I was sitting in a dimly lit back room of a cafe, the kind where the smell of stale beer fights for dominance with cigarette smoke and old wood. My contact slid an envelope across the table without looking up. Inside, grainy photos and a scribbled note. Not in the manifest. They said the capsule carried more than sensors, and steel, it held a film reel. Something classified, even, beyond the usual top-secret folders that got shredded before anyone could read them. My contact didn't know what was on it, only that it wasn't listed on any official documents, and its absence from the manifest was deliberate. I traced the lead to a cluster of engineers working on classified experiments in Leningrad. They were dismantling the capsule piece by piece, their faces expressionless under the harsh factory lights, handling it like a ticking time bomb. The absence of that film reel in official reports wasn't a clerical error, it was a strategic blackout. The government wanted it erased from memory, yet it stayed alive in hushed conversations and faded photographs. That piece of film wasn't just missing, it was a secret so dangerous, it could rewrite the rules of the Cold War. And that's when I realized I wasn't just chasing a capsule, I was chasing a shadow. The cafe was no place for secrets. Crowded, noisy, with the smell of burnt coffee and wet coats hung on hooks. I picked a corner table near the window, just far enough from the checkpoint to avoid unwanted eyes. The informant arrived late, face flushed, hands trembling slightly. As he slid a worn envelope across the table, inside were photos grainy, black and white, edges curling from age. They showed Soviet engineers, gloves smeared with grease, bent over the capsule's open hatch. The shots weren't just about dismantling, they were examinations, almost surgical. Like they were trying to understand something invisible, a bomb, without wires. I studied the images again and again, noticing the anxious glances exchanged by the men. They weren't just working. They were trying to piece together a puzzle someone didn't want solved. Outside, footsteps echoed close enough to make me flinch. Friedrichstrasse never slept, and neither did its shadows. I folded the photos, pocketed the envelope, and left knowing this was no simple espionage. It was a game with rules nobody explained. That's when I first heard the name, Perigi. The night I found the documents, the rain had been relentless. I ducked into the Berlin station, the cold seeping through my coat and straight into my bones. The stacks of classified files were buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, but my access was secured by a forged signature and an old contact who owed me more favors than I could count. Spread the papers across a battered table in the back room, illuminated only by a flickering bulb that buzzed like a warning. Among routine mission reports and innocuous memos, I found a file marked Black Budget, Department of Defense. The name wasn't familiar, but the code was stamped clearly, Project Perigi. The documents were incomplete, pages torn or missing, sentences cut off mid-thought. What remained hinted at a surveillance program operating far above the usual satellite intelligence. There were references to orbital detection systems and nuclear event monitoring that skirted the edges of legal authorization. No one ever admitted to knowing the project's existence. It was a shadow within a shadow, funded quietly and shielded from oversight. The budget figures were staggering, but the outcomes were classified as too sensitive to report. The name Perigi repeated in encrypted communications. Someone high up was pulling strings, but no name surfaced in the paper trail. I felt the weight of those missing pages more than the ones I held. What wasn't written was a question I couldn't ignore. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this secret buried, and I was starting to see why. The deeper I dug, the more the walls closed in. I realized this wasn't just about a stolen capsule. It was about a game played on orbit, far from any battlefield, where the stakes were invisible but deadly. And in that moment, I knew the story I'd been chasing was only just beginning. That spree was black that night, its surface broken only by the reflection of sodium lights from the far bank. I waited under the bridge, hands buried in my coat pockets, collar turned high against the damp. The city above moved in muffled echoes, tram wheels screeching, distant laughter, a drunk singing off-key somewhere near Friedrichshain. Down here, it was another Berlin entirely. My contact was late. That was unusual. He prided himself on precision, the kind of man who would rather abort a meeting than show up 2 minutes past the hour. When he finally appeared, he didn't offer the usual handshake. Just a quick glance over his shoulder before stepping into the shadow beside me. He spoke, in a low, flat tone, skipping pleasantries. Perigio, he said, not as a term of art, but as if it carried weight all its own. I asked if it was a codey name. He shook his head slowly, as though the explanation would cost him more than he could afford to lose. It's not a thing, he said. It's an orbit. A position, one we weren't supposed to use. I could hear the water slapping against the pilings as he leaned closer. The capsule wasn't the prize, he continued. It was the witness. That word stuck, witness. A piece of metal doesn't testify unless it's seen something worth killing over. He slipped a folded page into my palm. The paper was stiff, recently dried from being soaked. I didn't open it there. You don't read under a bridge unless you want your last view to be a flashlight beam and a pair of boots. We walked separately back toward the main street, never looking at each other. Again, not in my apartment. With the door locked and a chair braced under the knob, I opened the page. It was a partial transmission log timestamps, signal strength, and a short note in Russian. Object tracked, stationary, high inclination, no identification. The coordinates matched the capsule's last known orbit, and below them, in pencil, someone had written, "Not ours, not theirs." I lit a cigarette and stared at those words until the ash burned my fingers. Not ours, not theirs. That narrowed it down to nothing and everything all at once. A third player, one neither side wanted to admit existed. The next day, I tested the waters, dropped the word Parigio into a casual conversation with a junior handler at the station. He didn't flinch, he froze. Then he smiled too quickly and changed the subject to a harmless anecdote about his wife's new curtains. That told me more than any dossier could. That night, as I walked back from a meeting in Kreuzberg, I noticed the same black Volga parked 2 blocks from my building. The next morning, it was there again. No movement inside, no plates I recognized. They didn't follow me. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. We see you. I started sleeping in short bursts, the file from under the bridge hidden in the hollow leg of a desk chair. By the third night, the Volga was gone, replaced by a man in a gray overcoat loitering near the tram stop with a folded newspaper he never read. He wasn't KGB. He wasn't CIA. That was the part that kept me awake. Parigio wasn't a code for a place or an object. It was a position, a vantage point. And whoever had it could see everything. The capsule hadn't been stolen. It had been intercepted. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to learn what it had really seen before it fell. But in that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The package was thin, unmarked, and left in my postbox without so much as a return address. That in itself wasn't unusual. Half my work in Berlin moved through anonymous envelopes. What was unusual was the weight. Photographs have a feel when you hold them, a certain stiffness. This one felt too light, as if the images inside had been handled only once, and reluctantly, I locked the door before opening it. 4 prints, all on high-grade photographic paper, each one taken from what looked like a telescopic camera. The grain was heavy, the contrast harsh, but the subject was unmistakable. The NASA capsule, floating in orbit before its re-entry dock, it wasn't alone. In the second photo, a metallic object hovered just off its starboard side. Smooth, featureless, no visible antennae or markings, just a cold glint where the sun hit its surface. The third image caught it in a slightly different position, as if it had moved deliberately, keeping pace with the capsule. The last photo showed only empty space, the capsule now alone. On its final descent, I'd seen enough surveillance imagery to know when something had been tampered with. These hadn't. If they were fakes, they were flawless. But there was another problem. No camera I knew of could have taken these shots from that angle without being in orbit at the same time. That meant whoever had the camera had a seat at the same table as the capsule, and the object. My first call was to a contact in Geneva, someone with access to certain aerospace archives. I described the object without giving context. He was quiet for too long before answering. We've heard whispers. No one admits to ownership, not even the Soviets. Then, almost as an afterthought, if it's what I think it is, you shouldn't be calling me. He hung up. That night, I burned 2 of the photos in the sink. watching the edges curl and blacken. I kept the other two, not out of curiosity, out of obligation. If they were genuine, they were proof that the capsule's fall wasn't just an accident. Something had been there, watching, maybe guiding it. I stored the remaining prints in a sealed envelope tucked behind a loose brick in my kitchen wall, but hiding them didn't erase them from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smooth metallic surface, hanging in the void with no visible purpose, yet radiating intent. 2 days later, while walking through Alexanderplatz, I felt the kind of shadow that doesn't belong to a building. Someone was behind me, too far for casual proximity, too close for coincidence. I slowed. They slowed. I stopped at a kiosk. They pretended to study a rack of newspapers. The reflection in the kiosk's glass gave me a partial face. Not KGB, not CIA, just another unknown. And that was worse. Out back at my apartment, I checked the brick. The envelope was still there, but the photos? Gone. In their place, a single strip of paper with one word typed in block letters. Seen. And that was the moment I realized whatever game I was in, I was already playing it with someone who didn't need to bluff. Langley always smelled the same polished floors, burnt coffee, and that faint tongue of paper freshly pulled from a copier. I'd returned under the pretext of debriefing on unrelated operations, but my real reason was a name that had been whispered in a back hallway weeks earlier. Alan McCarthy, mid-level analyst, the kind who blended in so well you forgot he was. In the room, on paper, McCarthy was loyal, meticulous, and most dangerously predictable. He processed orbital telemetry, sifting through data that 90% of the agency couldn't make sense of. He was also one of only 3 people cleared to view the full, unredacted feed from Perigee. I started small. Lunch in the cafeteria. Idle conversation. About weather satellites. His eyes flickered only once when I mentioned the capsule by name. He covered it with a polite nod, but I'd already seen the reflex. Recognition mixed with caution. The trail got colder until I started looking outside. Langley's walls. That's where I found it buried in a personnel file from years back. His brother, James McCarthy, was an aerospace engineer stationed in Kazakhstan during the late 60s at a facility known for assembling high-priority satellites. It was the kind of posting that didn't happen without political blessings. I traced travel records, small financial transactions, the kind of breadcrumbs most people never notice. There were visits brief, unreported between the brothers during Alan's personal leave. One in particular stood out. Late summer 1974, a few weeks before the capsule fell. I pulled surveillance photos from the Berlin station's archive. One showed Alan in a cafe near the Friedrichstrasse crossing, sitting with a man I later confirmed was a Kazakh project supervisor. They weren't exchanging documents. They were laughing, 2 old friends comfortable in their conspiracy. Back at my hotel, I wrote a brief for internal review, but I didn't send it. I knew how this worked. Accuse the wrong man, and you become the wrong man. If Alan was feeding information to the Soviets, it wasn't out of ideology. It was something else, family, leverage, or both. I decided to test him. I left a message in his in-tray, sealed and unsigned. The orbit wasn't empty. No other context. By the next morning, the message was gone, and so was McCarthy. Officially, he was on assignment. Unofficially, no one would say where. Day after, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a hand-drawn diagram, the capsule, the unidentified object, and a line between them marked with a single word in red ink: transfer. That word was heavier than any confession. It meant the capsule hadn't just carried something. It had passed it on, and McCarthy had known exactly to whom. I lit a cigarette, staring at the paper until the edges blurred. The worst part wasn't that he'd betrayed the agency. It was that he'd done it so quietly, for so long, that none of us had noticed until it was already over. And in that moment, I knew the next move wouldn't be mine. Data came through, in the usual way, an intercept routed to the Berlin station by someone who didn't want their fingerprints on it. The paper was still warm from the machine when it landed on my desk, the ink smudged at the edges from being handled too quickly. The text was short. A telegram from Moscow to Havana. The language was coded, but casual. The kind of phrasing meant to slide past a clerk's attention. La ventana sobre Atlantico permanece abierta. I'd heard that phrase before, years earlier, in the context of anti-submarine surveillance. It wasn't just poetic, it was operational. If the window over the Atlantic was open, it meant they were watching something move beneath the surface. But in this case, the timing lined up too perfectly with the capsule's last orbit. The phrase wasn't about submarines. It was about what the capsule had seen before re-entry. I took the telegram to the listening post on the outskirts of the city. The operator, a pale man with nicotine-stained fingers, ran it against archived intercepts. He found 3 matches too from the early 70s, one from just months before. All 3 coincided with unusual orbital activity flagged in classified tracking logs. That activity always came from high-inclination orbits, the kind you'd use if you wanted to look down on both poles in a single sweep. And always over the Atlantic. It was becoming clear this was less about recovering a lost spacecraft and more about controlling what or who it had been watching. If perigee was indeed a position, this window might have been its operational sweet spot. I drafted a memo to Langley with my findings, but stopped halfway through. Sending it up the chain would only guarantee that it disappeared. Instead, I copied the telegram by hand and burned the original in an ashtray. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying with it the last physical trace of the message. That night, I met with an old Stasi contact at a disused rail yard. I showed him the handwritten copy. He frowned, ran his thumb over the paper, and asked where I'd gotten it. I told him. He didn't believe me. This phrase, he said, it was used once before, but not by us. It was NATO. He handed it back to me and walked off, leaving me with more questions than answers. If NATO had originated the code, and Moscow was now using it, it meant someone had been trading more than just hardware. They'd been trading language shared. Keys to a shared door. And suddenly, the Atlantic felt a lot smaller. The metropole was the kind of place that pretended not to notice who walked through its doors. Marble floors, chandeliers dulled by cigarette smoke, and a lobby where the concierge knew everyone's secrets, but never said a word. I'd arranged the meeting under a false name, the reservation paid in cash by a third party who didn't exist. The man I was here to see was a retired KGB colonel, gray hair, heavy overcoat, and the kind of eyes that still measured every doorway and window. He arrived without a handshake, settling into the armchair across from me with the precision of a man who'd spent his life avoiding sudden movements. For the first 20 minutes, we spoke in pleasantries, cold weather, trade fairs, the latest football scores. The waitress refilled our glasses twice before he finally leaned in and spoke quietly enough that I had to pretend to adjust my hearing. You think they wanted the capsule for its technology? He said. They didn't. He described how the retrieval team in the Atlantic had been ordered not to open the hatch, not to touch a single bolt until it was inside Soviet jurisdiction. They feared it would tell them something. His words were deliberate, as if searching for a translation that didn't exist. I asked what it had seen. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you know the truth will sound absurd. An orbit is like a stage, he said. Sometimes the actors are not in the script. He told me during its final revolution, The capsule's sensors had locked onto an object moving faster than any cataloged satellite. It had no transponder, no heat signature, and it stayed within visual range for nearly half an orbit. We could not catch it, but we could follow the one who saw it. When I pressed for details, he waved a hand, signaling the end of the topic. You don't need to know more. Knowing is already too much. He finished his drink, left cash on the reft table, and stood. Before walking away, he placed a small matchbox in front of me. Inside was a piece of heat shield material scorched, fractured, and on the inside surface, a faint, almost imperceptible etching. A series of dots and dashes. Morse code dot back in my room. I translated it. The message was short, chillingly so. Not alone. That should have been the moment I stopped. But by then, it was far too late to walk away. The microfilm was hidden in the last place I would have checked if not for the tip, wedged inside the hollow sole of a battered leather shoe. It was handed to me in a second-hand shop off Karl Marx Alley, the clerk insisting it was just my size, though we both knew it wasn't the shoes he was selling. Back in my flat, with the curtains drawn, I cracked open the heel and slid out a black canister no bigger than a cigarette. I set up the viewer and began scrolling through the frames. At first, it was routine imagery: Earth's curve, cloud formations, the occasional glint of a ship far below. Then the perspective shifted. The capsule's camera had been tracking something in the darkness. Not the metallic object from the earlier photographs. This was different. A geometric structure, faint against the black, its edges glowing with residual heat. It was positioned high over the Atlantic, holding steady in a way no natural body could dot. Next came a sequence of test frames, calibration shots. Only these weren't aimed outward. They were focused on the capsule's own hull. And there, mounted along the side, was a narrow cylindrical device I'd never seen in ESA schematics. A sensor? A transmitter? Whatever it was, the next frame showed it active, its housing lit from within by a pale, unnatural glow. The final series was the worst. Grainy, almost blurred, but the meaning was clear. This device was scanning. And what it scanned was not the Earth nor the stars, but a detonation silent, distant, unmistakable. A nuclear event, far below the surface of the ocean. I felt my stomach turn. This was more than surveillance. It was proof of a violation. A system placed in orbit to monitor nuclear activity where no treaty allowed. It explained the secrecy, the missing pages, the sudden interest from both sides. I leaned back, letting the film spin out, the frames fluttering in the dark. Whoever had designed this system had crossed a line so far over that neither the U.S. nor the Soviets could admit it existed. When I finally shut off the viewer, the room felt smaller, heavier. I slid the microfilm back into the canister, but I didn't hide it. I just left it on the table, as if pretending it wasn't mine could undo what I'd seen. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside, every creak, every footstep felt like the start of something I couldn't stop. And I knew, without question, that the last part of this story wouldn't be found in any file. The sea here is nothing like the show. Spree. It doesn't carry the whispers of a city. It swallows them whole. From my porch, I can see the horizon as a clean, empty line, but I know better. Out there, under that calm surface, lies the same Atlantic that swallowed the capsule. The same stretch of water that, decades ago, set everything in motion. I came here after Berlin became too loud with quiet questions. I traded my suit for a fishing jacket, my briefcase for a drawer full of unpaid bills. My neighbors think I'm just another pensioner wasting away by the coast. They're half right. Some nights, I sit with the old radio I've kept since those days. The casing is chipped, the dial's stiff, but it still hums when I turn it on. I scan the band slowly, listening for voices I know won't answer. I tell myself it's habit. It's not. I'm waiting for the wrong frequency, for the wrong voice to slip through. The matchbox from the Metropole sits on my desk, a burnt fragment of heat shield still inside. I've never shown it to anyone. Sometimes, when I hold it, I imagine the dots and dashes are still warm, as if the message hasn't finished traveling. Not alone. I used to think it was a warning. Now, I'm not so sure it wasn't a reminder. I've replayed the capsule's final minutes in my head more times than I care to admit. The object in orbit, the device mounted to its hull, the nuclear flash deep in the Atlantic, and then the fall calculated, deliberate. I used to wonder if it was an accident or a theft. Now I think it was neither. Someone wanted that capsule to change hands. Maybe to prove something. Maybe to trade something. Maybe just to remind the other side that the table had more chairs than they thought. I've been approached over the years, journalists, conspiracy chasers, even a few former colleagues. They all want the same thing, the truth. But I learned long ago that truth isn't currency, it's leverage. And I'm out of the game. Still, sometimes I catch myself writing down details on scrap paper, the coordinates, the code words, the faces. Then I burn them before I can think too hard about why I wrote them in the first place. Maybe I'm afraid that if I keep them, someone will come looking. Or maybe I'm afraid they won't. The thing about exile is you start to believe your own disappearance. You convince yourself the world has moved on, that the secrets you carried have dissolved into history. And then something small and unfamiliar ship on the horizon, a transmission with too much static, pulls you right back. Last winter, during a storm, the radio caught a burst of signal, so faint I almost missed it. Just a few seconds of clipped Morse before the wind drowned it out. I wrote it down out of reflex. Later, I realized it was the same sequence from the heat shield, repeated exactly. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the window, watching the black water churn, waiting for a shape to rise where the sea met the sky. It never did, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Now, each morning, I walk to the shore with my coffee and watch the Atlantic like it's an old friend I no longer trust. I tell myself I'm looking for the weather to change, but deep down, I'm watching for a shadow. The kind you can only see if you already know it's there. And when it comes, if it comes, I'll be ready. Not to stop it, not to expose it, but to recognize it. Because once you've seen what's out there, you can't go back to believing in empty skies. The part no one tells you about surviving in this business. Sometimes the silence doesn't mean it's over. It just means it's waiting. If you made it this far, maybe you were meant to hear this. Subscribe if you want to know what else never made it to the files. And tell me in the comments, did you already know about any of this? Or did I just ruin your sleep?